Last week we looked at part one of 2 parts on Sodom and Gomorrah. I think we could spend an awful lot of time looking at Sodom and Gomorrah. It's become synonymous with evil living and sin, and everything that's wrong with society. Let's just delve right into chapter 19 of Genesis and see what we can learn from this story. Genesis chapter 19, beginning at the first verses. The 2 angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. "My lord," he said, "please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning." "No," they answered, "we will spend the night in the square." But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him. He said, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." "Get out of our way," they replied. And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them." They kept bringing pressure on Lot and moved forward to break down the door. But the men inside reached out and pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. Then they struck the men who were at the door of the house, young and old, with blindness, so they could not find the door. The men said to Lot, "Do you have anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here, because we're going to destroy this place. The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it." So he went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were pledged to marry his daughters, and he said, "Hurry and get out of this place, because the Lord is about to destroy the city." But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. With the coming of dawn, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished." When he hesitated, the men grasped his hands and the hands of his wife and his 2 daughters and led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them. We could go on, but that's enough. It's a strange story. It's a tragic story. It's a story that can leave us shaking our heads in wonder at some of the things that went on there, being puzzled about it all. So what can we learn from it? Well, let's start by asking, what can we learn from the people of Sodom? They're the really colorful ones, so let's see what we can learn from them. First thing I think we need to understand from them, and this is actually stepping back a few chapters back to chapter 13 of Genesis, that affluence is not necessarily a sign of God's blessing. Sometimes we think it is, that if we're poor, God's not blessing us, but if we're rich, then God has blessed us. But it doesn't always work that way. If we go back to Genesis chapter 13, verses 10 to 13, we'll read this. It says, this is when Abraham and Lot were arguing, let's say, about living together. They had both become so rich they couldn't live together anymore because their flocks were too big and the land wouldn't support them all. So Abraham says to Lot, "You choose where you want to go, and you go there, and I'll go the other way." And this is what we read. "Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. And Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom." And then it goes on and says, "The men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord." So when we look at this, it tells us about the city of Sodom and the area where they lived, that it was well watered. And in those days, of course, we're going back 4,000 years, this is mostly a civilization of shepherds, and well-watered land meant, of course, pasture land. Lots of rich pasture land that would support large flocks of sheep and goats and whatever else. In other words, if the land was well-watered and you lived there, it was pretty affluent. So Sodom was a city of affluence by the standards of those times and days. But very clearly, it goes right on and says, but the people of Sodom were wicked. So affluence was no sign of blessing for them. And it's important for us to realize that. How we stand in terms of rich or poor is no indication of whether or not God has blessed us. Sometimes, in fact, riches can be a curse. Can't it? It can very much be a curse. It can distract us from the things that matter. The Bible tells us that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. So we need to be very, very careful if we think we want to make that connection between riches and blessing, because it just simply isn't there. Now, what exactly was the sin of Sodom? That's been a question that's been debated long and hard. If you look at the story, what exactly was it that God was punishing them for? And people have used this passage for all kinds of arguments about it. Some people have said, well, they were being punished because they were inhospitable. In the Middle Eastern culture, hospitality is very important. Strangers, you invite them into your home and you feed them even if you don't have much yourself. It's very, very important that you take care of them. And Lot brings them into his house and he says, they've come under the protection of my roof. And he really has taken on an obligation that hospitality is so important that he is now obligated to protect them with his very life. And we see exactly the opposite on the part of the people of Sodom, don't we? That they want to mistreat them, not protect them. So some people have said that they're guilty of inhospitality, and that is a serious, major sin in that society. Other people have gone on and said that their sin is homosexuality, because we're looking at the men of Sodom wanting to have sexual relations with these men, or the angels who came into the appearance of men. Other people have said, well, it's not that, it's the fact that they want to rape them, and rape is their sin. And others have just been more broad and said, well, look, it's just that they're violent. They're a violent, hateful people. And the reality is, if we just going back there to Genesis 13, when it just talks about them being wicked, that it's not a specific sin. They're not guilty of just one thing. They're guilty through and through. All of the things that are described in the story are symptoms of a broader disease. And that's the very nature of human sin. We call it in our doctrines of the Salvation Army total depravity. That every bit of who we are, that sin reaches into who we are, through and through. Sin is the disease. The actions or the behaviors are the symptoms. And some of those may be very, very obvious. Some of them may be very, very cruel. Some of them may be very, very violent. Some of them are very, very subtle. We can still be what the world calls good people and still be just as totally depraved as the person who was violent and hateful. Some sins are very common, but everyone is susceptible to something different. There's some things that we all probably are guilty of. But I'm going to guarantee that each one of us is more susceptible to something different than the person next to you. What really afflicts me may not be an issue at all to you. What affects you may not be an issue to me. So we can be very good at saying, see, be like me. You're bad because you've got that. But that's not the reality. The reality is we're all different. And my sin and your sin are different. Symptoms show up in different ways. But ultimately, Ultimately, the problem of sin and the problem of the people of Sodom and the problem of anywhere, in any society, is ultimately that sin is the rejection of God. It is the rejection of His ways and His standards. It's setting someone or something else, and that may include ourselves, up in His place as the God of our lives. When we do that, when we allow something else to be more important than God, anything else, our own welfare, our own comfort, our own families, our own jobs, good works, you name it, we can set anything else up. We are putting ourselves into a danger situation. We are allowing the disease to take over. And who knows how that's going to end up. A lot of people have started out well and started out with good intentions, but because they have allowed something else to creep in, they have gone astray and fallen into some form of corruption. How many times have we seen that from religious leaders even? How many religious leaders have fallen because they have allowed the adoration of their congregation, particularly the TV evangelists, they've allowed that adoration to take over, and they've lost sight of things. There've been, remember Jimmy Jones down in Guyana drinking the purple Kool-Aid? He started out as a powerful evangelist. He lost sight of what was important, and as things started to crumble, he allowed corruption for raising more and more money to do good works. But he lost sight of the truth, and he thought that the works were more important than the truth. And the rest is history. And we allow something other than God and His ways to set the standard. So it's not limited to one thing, but it also permeated their entire culture, their entire population. Did you get that as I read it in verse 4? It says, before they laid down, before Lot and the angels laid down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house. This was not an isolated thing. This city had become corrupt. The sin of individuals can spread through the whole population. Jesus talked about a little bit of yeast can infect the whole batch of dough. And so it is so it was then, and so it can be in our society, so it can be in a church. If we allow one little thing to go accepted, how it can spread. Things that were once thought unthinkable in our society can easily become generally accepted. How many things can we think? Go back a few years. Gambling. Oh my goodness, gambling is one of those terrible sins, isn't it? Gambling you can't escape from now. Pornography was a thing of shame, the joke that, guys would have to sneak into the back door of the CD theater. Well, now you don't have to do that, just turn your television on, because it's so accepted in our society, it's right on TV, and on and on and on. Because it's accepted in one spot and affects the entire society. Social standards and social norms, really are not a very good standard for judging what's right and wrong. The things that our society says is okay doesn't make it okay. Just think about societies throughout the world and history. There were ancient societies that thought that human sacrifice was okay and it was perfectly normal and reasonable for them. But because it was normal and reasonable for them, did that make it right? Go back just a few years in Nazi Germany. The majority of the population thought that persecuting the Jews was fine. Anti-Semitism was normal. They were inferior. That was common. Did that make it right? Look at modern views today of human sexuality. It's become normal now in our society to reject the idea that sex belongs only in marriage. and that marriage is defined as a permanent and exclusive relationship between one man and one woman. Society rejects that idea. We think we're thought to be backward and old-fashioned and prudish because we hold on to those biblical ideas. The people of Sodom were so steeped in their sin, and it becomes so much a part of them that they weren't even ashamed of it. Just think about it. A public demonstration of sin. How much we see that today. Sin is paraded because, hey, anything goes, right? Reality is that when there is no shame, there is little likelihood of repentance. The people of Sodom were not going to turn back to God. Abraham, or the angels, any of them could have preached the gospel all they wanted, but they were so hardened in their sin, they were so unashamed of it, they weren't going to turn back to God very likely. And that's something that's hard to deal with, hard to realize. But you know, we talked in our Bible class this morning about the parable of the sower, where the sower spreads the seed. In other words, talking about people sharing the gospel. And so the first place it fell on was the path, the hardened, beaten down path where there was no possibility of the seed taking root. But did that stop the sower from spreading seed there? No. And so God tells us that we still need to preach the gospel to anybody who will hear. We call it ready, fire, aim, instead of ready, aim, fire. We throw the gospel out. We need to throw the gospel out wherever we can, because we have no way of knowing where hearts are hard and hearts are open. We have no way of knowing what ways that we might be able to work the soil and soften it up and make people ready to hear the gospel. Where they may learn that sin is a shameful thing. But unless we stand on the truth, unless we are the light of the world, there's not going to be anybody telling them that sin is shameful, that sin is wrong. The world needs something different. Sodom was a mess. Not too far different than some parts of our society, some parts of our world. It was a mess, and they fell under God's judgment because of it. God was fortunately merciful. God wanted them to be saved, but there wasn't much saving to be done there. And in the midst of all that, we find Lot, Abraham's nephew. What do we learn from Lot and his family? This guy who lived in the midst of sin. Was Lot a part of the mess? Was he one of these sinful, wicked men? Evidently not, because God went and he rescued him from there. So we learn a few things from him. First of all, we learn that it is actually possible to be righteous in the midst of a lot of sin. Well, that's reassuring for God's people. Abraham had talked to God and said, if you find 50 righteous people, are you going to destroy the city? Would that be right? And he works it all the way down to 10 people. What about 10 people? And God says, if I find 10 righteous people, I won't destroy the city. The angels didn't find 10 righteous people. They did find Lot. They did find Lot. Look at him. Look at this man in the midst of this wicked city. He receives the angels graciously, with all the rules of hospitality that he should have in those days. He didn't participate in the evil that the rest of the city wanted to perpetrate. He actually resisted them. He attempted to stop them. You know, the Bible talks about a remnant. A remnant. In the midst of everything that goes wrong, in the midst of all the sinfulness, in the midst of all the apostasy, that is, the turning away from God, there will always be, God says, a small remainder of people who remain faithful. The prophet Elijah had just won a great victory for God over the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings chapter 19. But afterwards, he feels alone and abandoned because he's being persecuted. And twice he complains to God. He says, I'm the only one left. I've been zealous for you, but I'm the only one left. He says, what's the point in going on? It's hopeless. So God turns around and he says to him, I will leave 7,000 in Israel. All the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. There wasn't much left in Israel that had remained faithful, but he's saying, Elijah, you're not alone. There are 7,000 people in Israel, the remnant who remains faithful. And there will always, always be a remnant. In our secular and godless world, the church is, or at least is intended to be, assigned the role of the remnant, if you like. We are called to be God's holy people. In the midst of all the sin and evil that surrounds us, we are God's holy people. And what does that mean, to be holy? Holy means to be separated. To be called out and be separate from the things of the world. Are we separate from the things of the world? I read an article in our own Salvationist magazine not too long ago, and it asked whether or not the church, or even the Salvation Army specifically, was still leading the world on a particular issue, or if we had fallen behind on this issue. And as I read this, I was really troubled by it. I wanted to write a letter to the editor on it, of the Salvationists, but he didn't give that opportunity for that particular article. Because the reality is that we can never be behind or ahead of the world on any issue. We can never fall behind them, and we can never be ahead of them, because we are never on the same road. We are never on the same road. If we are indeed a holy people, we're on a completely different road. We are separated from them. The ways of the world and the ways of the people of God are completely different. That is how we are light in the darkness, to show the true way. And God has called us to be that. God has equipped us to be that. And Lot is an example of the fact that you can be a righteous man in the midst of evil. We are called to be that even today. But Lot also serves as a warning for us as well. Because being righteous does not necessarily mean being perfect. And it doesn't necessarily mean being unaffected by the sin that's around us. Lot was considered to be a righteous man, but his actions were far from perfect. They were far at times from righteous. There is no possible way to justify what he did when he offered his daughters up to the crowd. He was showing the twisted, demented, corrupt thinking of the people of Sodom. It's been said that sometimes we have to choose the lesser of two evils. The reality is we are never called to choose the lesser of two sins. No sin is justified by its actions. The Apostle Paul was accused of teaching that. And he said, what? Shall we do wrong, that good may come of it? Heaven forbid! We can never justify sin by saying good things have come from it. And that's what Lot was doing. Trying to protect and prevent an evil by offering up another evil. He could have offered up his own life, but he could not offer someone else's. He could offer his own life, as Jesus said, greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. But who was he to offer up his daughters? That was the thinking of that corrupt, godless, violent people. His righteousness was not based on his actions. We saw that not long ago as we looked at Abraham, when he believed God and God credited it to him as righteousness. We won't go on through the life of Abraham. We'll find Abraham does a lot of things that are wrong too. But he was a man of faith, as imperfect as he was. It was his faith obedience to God that made him righteous. And what's more, not only was Lot influenced by the thinking of the people of Sodom, he actually became comfortable living there. I mean, he's out casually sitting by the city gate, not worried about what's going on. And then, as things are getting tense, as the climax is coming, as the destruction is about to fall upon the city, as the judgment is there, you find its morning has come already. He stayed the night. Imagine this. The message comes that Toronto is going to be destroyed tonight. Where are you going to be come morning? Are you going to still be here? But morning comes, and where do we find Abraham and his family? Still in Sodom. Still in Sodom. Verses 15 and 16 is what we read. As morning dawned, the angel urged Lot to start pushing him. Take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in punishment with the city. Get this. But he lingered, or he hesitated. Why? Because he had grown attached to the city. He had grown attached to his home. He started to see Sodom as his home. And he was hesitant to leave it. How attached have we become to our earthly homes? The Bible tells us that we are strangers, that we are aliens here. That we are not citizens of this world, but we are citizens of another world. But how many of us have grown comfortable and attached? Doesn't take much, does it? Anybody like the life we have here? Most of us kind of like it. You know, the reality is there's typically not a whole lot that distinguishes Christians from everyone else in the world. And that's pretty sad, isn't it? Why? Because we have become so attached to the world and the stuff that's in it. Most of you know that I'd like to go on missionary work, to Africa, one of the poorest countries in the world. And one of the reasons that I'm interested in that is very simply because it would force me to leave behind so many of the luxuries and comforts that I've become overly attached to. Because I know how hard it is to let it go, needing to be forced to do so. Philippians 3:10 is my favorite verse in Scripture. And I find it funny when it says, Paul says, all I want is to know Christ and to experience the power of his resurrection. You get this, to share in his sufferings. Anybody want to share in suffering? To become like him in his death. But it doesn't come naturally because we grow attached to the world and its comforts and its pleasures. We need to let go of this world. We need to indeed become the holy people that God wants us to be. To let go of the things that will fall, that we can't take with us, as they say. Well, very quickly, I want to just finish off. What do we learn from the angels? The angels teach us a lesson too. I want to go through it very, very quickly because time is just about up. First thing is that the angels teach us that God will help the righteous. That's good to know, isn't it? In the midst of all the hardship and the difficulties, God will help the righteous. Look at, even Jesus needed that. Back when he was tempted, we read in Matthew 4:11, after his temptation, he says, the devil left Jesus, and get this, the angels came and helped him. God provides the help and the strength that we need. In fact, Paul went on and said this. It says, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. But God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide a way of escape that you may be able to endure. Isn't that what happened with Lot? God provided. The wicked, they get everything they want. What am I doing? Am I missing something by being faithful to God? But then he goes on and says, But when I thought how to understand this, it seemed to me a wearisome task. He says, until I stepped into the sanctuary of God, until I came into the presence of God, then I discerned their end. Truly, God, you set them in slippery places. You make them fall to ruin. How they are destroyed in a moment, swept away utterly by terrors. Like a dream when one awakes, O Lord, when you rouse yourself, you despise them as phantoms. The time is coming. God opposes the wicked, where he helps the righteous. God will judge and punish sin. But the good news for all is that ultimately he poured that punishment out on his Son, Jesus Christ, at the cross. That the way of escape for anyone and everyone who is there, if they will simply come to Jesus. That we don't have to be swept away. That Jesus has offered us the gift of life. That our sins can be forgiven. That we can be cleansed from all unrighteousness. Even Sodom had that opportunity, had they wanted it, to turn back to God. That's good news. That's the good news we live in. That's the good news God has given us to share. Because we are Lot in Sodom. We need to be righteous. We need to be holy. We need to be the bearers of good news. We need to start by coming to God, being sure that we are, in fact, clean. That we have not been corrupted by the world. We have not allowed the sin of Sodom, the sin of the world, to afflict us. And I just want us to